Well, it's a crazy world, isn't it?
Yes.
Has it ever been this crazy?
No.
I mean, I'm 62 years old now, and I've never seen a world like this. This is not, my dearly departed parents, I don't believe, would recognize America today. And my mom hasn't been gone that long. So it's changing very rapidly. And one of the reasons why it is changing, in fact, I believe the fundamental reason that it is changing as rapidly as it is what we're going to go over tonight. See, it's all a matter of who benefits. What was it, the Latin que bono? Who benefits? Well, it's just universal that there's a beneficiary to practically everything, that every issue that's before us, whether it's education. And what's interesting about it is that there's a parallel circumstance between all of the issues. The beneficiaries overwhelmingly are corporations, because the corporations have bought enough influence in our government to be able to dictate terms to the government. And they do it very well. And that's exactly what you're talking about. Well, just take that and overlay the entire earth with that. And that's what you have here. That's why our it's crazy in education. Everybody's against it. Everybody's against Common Core. All of your elected officials are against Common Core. All the people are against Common Core, but Common Core keeps getting ramrodded into the school systems with everybody against it, universally. How does this happen? It's happening covertly. It's happening behind our backs. They're wriggling their way in behind our backs, and they're having their way because they have all the money in the world to hire the attorneys to be able to write
They are writing
constitutional amendments in such a way to make it sound palatable. Well, that's the way they've done all of our education bills. They have created language to make it sound like it's great, but it turns out it's all, when you add them all together, what they amount up to is Common Core. But none of them say Common Core in it. That's how clever these people are. Well, we've got some very clever people that we're dealing with on the world stage as well. It's the same thing. It's just the entire world. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Geopolitics of the petrodollar. Or I call it how the world really works. Because this is, when I get done with it tonight, you're going to see that there is a hidden hand behind geopolitical events. It's kind of like Adam Smith, the hidden hand behind the economy. Well, there's a hidden hand here that is orchestrating world events, and that's what this whole thing is about. But before I get into that, you have to understand on a local basis or on a national basis this system that is pervading the entire world. And so I'm going to give you a little primer on the Federal Reserve so that you understand what we're going to be expanding onto a global scale. The Federal Reserve is a private corporate entity owned by commercial banks. This is all over the world, as we're going to see. This is not just in America, but the Federal Reserve, there is a parallel private central bank that is practically in every one of the Western industrialized nations, and they are all private, they're all owned by the banks. Secondly, the power in these central banks is concentrated into a very few banks. In our case, the few banks are on Wall Street. 70% of the capitalization of the Federal Reserve System is in 10 Wall Street banks. What that means is 70% of the power, actually more than that, because that much power means that you have all of the power of the Federal Reserve is concentrated in these 10 Wall Street banks. All Federal Reserve currency, does anybody have any currency in their pocket that's not Federal Reserve currency? No? No? Well, what I'm saying is all your money, all the money in the entire economy, and world economy really, is borrowed at interest into circulation. That's how money is created. It is borrowed into existence. And before you borrowed it to buy that car or that boat or whatever it was that you borrowed money for, that money did not exist. It was on nobody's balance sheet, but the minute that you signed your name on the dotted line and you borrowed that money, all of a sudden the money sprang into existence. It came out of the air. It entered in on the bank's balance sheet, and it entered as an asset, and it entered on your balance sheet as a liability, and you've got to pay it back. Now that money went to whoever you bought the boat from. So he took it and he paid his bills with it. So what we end up doing is paying our bills and buying things with legal tender that's not really an asset. We're not trading assets for assets, we're trading liabilities for assets. That's the lie of this entire thing. In Christian terms, you might think that this is satanic because they're fooling you into believing that you have these assets in your pockets when they're really liabilities. Someone has got to pay that back to the heir through the bank who issued it. The Fed does not print enough money to pay the interest on the monies that is borrowed. So here it is, the Federal Reserve, through the banks that issue it, they're receiving interest on every dollar in circulation out there, but they don't print the money to pay the interest. What I'm telling you right now is the secret of why the entire country, not only us personally as a people, but our government is in debt. And it cannot stop as long as this system is alive. Because they don't print the interest to pay the interest. The only way to pay the interest is to borrow more currency from the Fed, and pay the interest on the old debt out of new debt just borrowed. That's the key. What I just told you is so profound that hardly anybody knows, but that is why the debt keeps going up and up and up and up and up. Not only for us personally as a people, but also for the U.S. government, because the U.S. government opted into this system back in 1913. It opted in, but it didn't have to. That's the crime of it all. It didn't have to. The Federal Reserve System is a scam, a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme, whatever you want to call it. There's never enough money to pay the system off. And there's another presentation that I do that I'm going to be doing on October the 3rd at the Hall County Republican Club, South Hall Republican Club, where I get into the way that this system gets solved. You have to pay it off. We have a debt-based private banking system that can only be paid off with an equity-based public monetary system. There is an answer to this, and I firmly believe that Donald Trump knows the answer, because when you get so tuned into this frequency, the things that he says tells me that he knows everything that I'm going to tell you tonight, which is comforting for me. All right, so as long as the Federal Reserve controls the issuance of American currency, it is mathematically impossible for America to become anything other than a nation completely encumbered in debt. That is the bad news. As long as the Fed's there, as long as the banks control the issuance of currency, this system is in place. It's orchestrated and it's created of, by, and for the banks, not of, by, and for the people. Well, Donald Trump has told us he's going to return this government to a government of, by, and for the people. Well, the route to that goes right through the Federal Reserve's front door. American currency is nothing but debt being paid in exchange for assets. We already talked about that. Federal Reserve currency is the reserve currency of the world. Whoa. Okay, so we've infected the entire world with a system like this, and we're going to get a little bit more in depth with that. And so therefore, as long as Federal Reserve currency remains the reserve currency of the world, it is mathematically impossible for the world to become anything other than a world completely encumbered in debt. We have a world completely encumbered in debt, and that is the problem with the world economy. That is the problem with the American economy. We can't come back because the debt has gotten so large that it has crowded out our ability as a people to pay it back. That is the secret. That's what no one's going to tell you regarding the American economy. There are certain people that are doing well. Wall Street's doing well. Any people that have been invested in the Wall Street bubble, they're doing very well, or they think they are, until it pops. But But people in Main Street, this is a system that I call trickle-up poverty, because it starts at the very bottom, the people who are least able to pay their own way in this world, and they become on government assistance. But it goes up and up and up and up and up, so it trickles up as we go. All right, I said the world is infected with this system. I just want to show you. See, right here, that's the United States. I know you can't read it, but it says that the United States government is 19 trillion and some odd in debt. The next one there is Great Britain, and I think it's like 9 trillion. And then this is like 80 different countries of the world, and all of them are in debt. When you found out that our country was in such debt, did you think, well, we must owe this, we must owe it all to China. We must owe it to different countries of the world, and all these countries have loaned us all this money. No, they're in debt too.
Is China in debt?
China is here, but they're way on down the list because they don't play in this game to the extent that we do and that the Western countries do. So this is another 80, and this is another 40, right down to the very bottom. So here it is that all the nations of the world are in debt. How is that possible? Who is the lender of all of that money? If you don't know who the lender is, then how are you going to pay it back? Well, we know who the lender is, and that's part of this satanic lie. It is the private banking system of the world. It is this cabal, this cartel of central banks that print the money out of the air, and they have bought enough influence in all of these 200 of the largest countries in the world. They have bought enough influence to get their parliaments or their Congress to adopt their system as the means by which they operate their economy. Can you believe this? I mean, I know this stuff like the back of my hand, but I still look at it and go, how on earth can people be this stupid to allow a private central bank that's unaccountable to anyone to own this franchise? So that gets us, that's the kind of precursor. So I set the stage for us to take this on to the next step so that you can understand how the world really works here. But geopolitics is all about money and resources. Now, money plus resources and the control and ownership of them equate to power. That's what geopolitics is all about, the control of money and resources and what the pursuit causes to happen in the world. Now, there's a reason why I'm going to go here, and it's because of a video that I'm going to show you in just a minute. This seems like I'm diverting off track a little bit, and I've already talked about satanic this and satanic that. There is a spiritual component to this if you're, say, of the Judeo-Christian biblical mindset. Life on earth for the elite, because there is a ruling elite who they own and control the banks who issue the money to the world, is all about infinite money. They print money out of the air. Infinite money pursuing scarce resources. Scarce resources, by definition, the resources are scarce in this world. And that's one of the reasons I believe that God set it up this way. So we all have to contend for resources. Are we going to consume something, or are we going to give something to our neighbor? Well, if they're scarce, that comes into question. If they're not scarce, then we don't have to make that decision. We don't have this moral decision to make all day long whether we're going to use something or give it to someone else. Life on earth for most, like us, is about scarce money pursuing scarce resources. So we have a certain ruling elite who have all the money in the world, but they see us, we're using up all these resources. You know, can you imagine how they might think if they have all the ability in the world to buy resources? So for a very few elite who possess infinite money to pursue scarce resources, life becomes an endeavor to consume or gather those resources before they're used up. Before we use them up, they want to control it all. That's just a natural way of thinking. And it's a worldly way of thinking in a biblical sense, using that word worldly. So in an environment of infinite money, where pursuing scarce resources, the love of money will manifest. So if we were living in a place where there were no scarce resources, there was no race to control everything for people who had this ability to pay infinite money, then this wouldn't come into effect. But the love of money, once you're there, it's got to control you. It's got to control you. It's like they say that the worst thing in the world is inherited wealth, because then you're worried about losing it. Well, that's where they are. They don't want to lose the power. Well, this man right here is standing in their way. Right now, that man right there is the scariest person in the world for these people, because he is one guy standing in their way. Can you imagine the situation that he's in, the peril that he's possibly in? Because these people are ruthless, as we're going to find out. So the love of money, of course, biblically is the root of all evil. So I introduced the term evil into this for a reason, because this is a spiritual evil that I'm talking about here. Now, both Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy gave speeches in 1961, and they warned the American people against what would happen if they did not remain alert and knowledgeable. And what they warned us about is actually manifesting, and it has been manifesting for several decades. It's just coming to a boil right now. So I want to play you back. I want to play you what these two presidents said, and watch for the term spiritual to come up, because this President Eisenhower is going to use that term. That's why I go there.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportion. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources
There's that term
into the
again.
building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
Okay, those two guys just told us what we're facing right now. This is a corporate entity or consortium that has practically infinite power. And both of those presidents used the term vast. It's vast. It's all over the earth. And President Eisenhower used the term spiritual. That's why I brought it in there. He said that spiritual influence is felt in all government offices. That's what he said, from local to state to federal offices. He said a spiritual evil. Now, most people have heard that before, and they don't pick up on it. That he's trying to warn us of what we're going to be facing in the future. And then President Kennedy, I'm going to show you what he just said, just a minute. All right, now, Kennedy is assassinated, of course. And the next thing that happens is the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1961. Any Vietnam vets in here?
I am, but I was not in Vietnam.
Well,
I was there during the era. I mean, I was in service during the era.
well, this is why you were there. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was used as the means to convince Congress to give President Johnson the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that allowed him the authority to put forces over there in Vietnam, which escalated into the Vietnam War, whatever you might want to call it. But this is Robert McNamara. He was Secretary of Defense under Kennedy as well as Johnson. And after JFK was murdered, the U.S. government lied to the American people regarding the reason for the Vietnam War, that reason being supposed as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which all later admitted did not happen. Now, this was in the 1980s when he actually owned up to this.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
Didn't happen. So the entire war, 58,000 Americans went to their death. There was a wall in Washington, D.C. because an incident they said happened, did not happen. Now, if it hadn't been this incident, it would have been something else that they would come up with. There is a recording. You know how they used to, they probably still do, I don't know. They used to record conversations in the Oval Office. There's a recording of LBJ giving Robert McNamara his orders to create an incident so that LBJ can, quote, go over there and kill some people. And then Robert McNamara says, I'll see what we can do, sir. So there's not even an argument to be made that they thought at the time that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was really real. So, that said, why would LBJ lie about the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Well, it's one of those resources. This is a geopolitical event. It's money. Money. Who benefits from the money?
Military-industrial complex.
Okay. So it's all fitting into a picture that should start congealing in your head here. That it's all about money. Need we guess? It's the military-industrial complex. So just who is the military-industrial complex? Well, John F. Kennedy told us. You see, I don't think they talked about this. I don't know, they may have talked about it, but these two speeches given about 4 months apart told us a lot about what we're facing today. So who is the military-industrial complex? Well, John F. Kennedy told us. It's a worldwide, covert, monolithic, ruthless conspiracy. Ruthless connotes evil. Spiritual evil. It's ruthless. It infiltrates and intimidates. And what he said was, it infiltrates rather than allowing elections. So what are we all worried about right now? A stolen election? Well, someone's going to infiltrate if it's going to be stolen. So we're talking about the same people. Oh, subverts elections was the next one. It has vast resources, just like Eisenhower said. Both of these guys agree. It covertly operates in the military, the diplomatic, the intelligence, the economic, the political, and the scientific. This is what we're up against, folks. I mean, and this isn't Hank talking. I know people, I've been called a conspiracy theorist for the several years now. This isn't me. This is John F. Kennedy. This is Eisenhower telling us this stuff. So, this is my definition, but I think it's pretty good. The military-industrial complex is a worldwide, transnational, corporate consortium of unimaginable wealth held together with the glue of a worldwide monetary system comprised of central banks possessing the legal right to issue currency at interest to the nations of the world. That's why I showed you all those nations. They're all in debt to the particular portion of the military-industrial complex, which is the monetary glue that holds it all together. So here it is in 1964, our country completely changed directions. Here it is, John F. Kennedy's, he's trying to pursue peace. Well, what's Donald Trump trying to pursue? He's trying to pursue peace and understanding, détente with the nations of the world. Well, the last guy to really try to do that was John F. Kennedy. So here it is, we changed directions and we have the Great Society. It's built on mounting debt and deficit spending. We got to pay for this stuff somehow. Who benefits? The owners of the currency. The more money you borrow, then the beneficiaries are the ones who receive the interest, and as you try to pay back the principal as well. So the owners of the currency, that's the Federal Reserve System, inclusive of the Wall Street banks we talked about. So you got your Wall Street bankers there. All right, in 1965 through 1971, LBJ escalates the war in Vietnam that was trumped up in the first place, killed 58,000 Americans, millions of Vietnamese, and Nixon inherits this situation. Now, he asked for it, so I got no sympathy for him, but he inherited. The entire war effort was paid for out of debt and deficit spending. Again, up to this point, we had never had debt and deficit spending like this before. So this is an entirely new thing, because we were on a system called the Bretton Woods system. It was essentially the gold standard. And gold standard has one reason, and that's try to keep dishonest bankers honest. That's the one purpose behind the gold system in the first place. Well, we're on it, and the bankers are printing money out the wazoo. The U.S. government is borrowing the money from the bankers out the wazoo, and we're paying for all these wars that were trumped up by the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So who benefits? Military-industrial complex, all the war material. You drop it. The fastest way to make a lot of money is make sure that you don't have to wait for depreciation in order to have to replace the item that you just built. Bombs are a good way to do that. But you don't have to worry about, you don't have to wait for a car to depreciate. It may take 20 years conceivably. But bombs, you can drop a lot of them and have to replace them real quick. So there's a lot of money in war. And then, of course, the Wall Street bankers, because they're the ones that finance all this stuff to their corporate cousins inside the military-industrial complex. So in 1971, we're coming up to a hinge point in history here. 1971, Nixon, faced with the Great Society and Vietnam War debts paid for by U.S. dollars, finds that he cannot keep printing and borrowing money to pay these debts. Why? Because I already said it. The gold standard. We had a gold standard that, according to the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1947 after World War II, that the nations of the world, now we couldn't buy it, but the nations of the world could redeem their U.S. dollars because it was agreed to be the world reserve currency for $35 an ounce. And that was going to create a real stable environment, stable monetary system for the entire world. Well, when we start printing money, and the money starts going all over the world, and it starts accumulating in different countries of the world, and then they go back to the Federal Reserve gold window and say, how do I like to redeem these? Well, they look at the amount of gold they got over there, and they look at the amount of dollars that they spent over here, and the two don't match up. So in 1971, there was only one choice. Nixon decoupled the U.S. dollar from the gold standard, transforming the U.S. monetary system from an equity-based, it was equity-based because every dollar supposedly had gold behind it. So you could turn it in for gold, into a new debt-based system. That's the system that we're operating under now. That's where all the dollars are printed out of the air and they're loaned into existence. So I want to play this for you so that you get a real good idea of what he said.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? The gainers are the international money speculators.
Because
they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. What does it mean for you? Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest.
Okay, did you pick up on all the lies? Yeah. He's lying to you. First of all, it wasn't the money speculators. It was the foreign countries trying to get their gold from the Federal Reserve gold window. And then he's saying that he's going to temporarily suspend the gold standard. Well, I don't even know what authority he had to do that. I really don't. As much as I know about it, don't know what he did. But obviously they had no intentions on going back to a gold standard here.
De Gaulle from France came in and
Yeah.
demanded $3 billion in
Demanded.
exchange, and that's when he did that.
Exactly.
That was August 15th,
It was the French.
1971, and that's when you had floating currencies after that.
Exactly, exactly. Now, he said, he was talking about the bugaboo of devaluation, and if you're, as long as you're buying goods and services produced in this country, well, they're not even produced here anymore. That's all part of this. That's why it's happening here. So here's the lack of devaluation in the dollar since 1971 here. Now, this only goes up to 2011. It's continued on down, but it was worth 18 cents since the gold standard was removed. So it's just nothing but one lie after another to cover up the fact that they've been printing money. They had to get these war debts paid off to the military-industrial complex and back to the bankers of Wall Street. That's what all that's about. So in 1974, he talked about a new world monetary system. Wow, can you imagine if somebody said that today? A new world money? Well, they're going to. It's going to happen. By 1974, the petrodollar system was in full operation in Saudi Arabia. Kissinger, Secretary of State Kissinger, went to the Saudis and said, okay, we need to cut a deal here. We can no longer use gold to back our dollar. We need something else to back the dollar. We want to back it with oil. But it's not our gold, it's your oil. You see, the difference is we went from an equity-based gold system to a debt-based oil system. And so this is key to understanding where we are in the world today. This is the principles of the petrodollar agreement. In exchange for U.S. protection of Saudi oil fields, because anybody could have come in there and just kind of take over the country, so they were concerned about that. The Saudis agreed to price all of their oil sales in U.S. dollars. In other words, the Saudis were going to refuse all other currencies except for the U.S. dollar as payment for oil exports. That's going to mean automatically that all the countries of the world got to have U.S. dollars in their pockets if they want to buy energy from Saudi Arabia. This is a reason for the world to help place a demand on the U.S. dollar. Secondly, the Saudis agreed to place their deposit their oil revenues in Wall Street banks. So we're talking about what my friend Derek Grayson calls a circle of loot. So the money starts off in Wall Street banks, but it's loaned out there. But then it comes back to the Wall Street banks, and the Wall Street banks can use that money as deposits. And under the rules of the Federal Reserve, for their deposits, they can multiply any of their deposits by a factor of 10, use 9/10 of that, and loan it out. And or now, they can even invest in stocks or derivatives. This is where all the money has come from in order to put all these banks into the position of being able to do all these derivative deals. They take their deposits, multiply it by 10, take 9/10 of that, and they do stuff with it like pump up a stock bubble like we have right now. The Saudis would invest surplus oil proceeds in U.S. debt securities. So here it is. The system that Kissinger went to the Saudis with results in the Saudis' oil proceeds being funding Wall Street and simultaneously funding the U.S. government, because they've promised they're going to put the money either in Wall Street banks or they're going to put it in buying U.S. treasuries. So, great deal. This is wonderful. Wall Street flourishes and we get all of our debts paid through the petrodollar system. But it begot an unholy alliance between the Saudis and the Wall Street banks and the U.S. government. Now, we're going to talk about this too. Where were 15 of the 19th hijackers come from on 9/11? Well, now how on earth are we going to go after the Saudis? Because if they decide then that to back out of this deal, then what's going to happen to the value of the dollar? So you're in a situation where it is an unholy alliance. There's that spiritual connection again. All three have vested interests in maintaining the value of the US dollar. The Saudis don't want anything to happen to the dollar because they're invested in Wall Street. So if something happens to the dollar, then they're nothing. They just lost everything. And the same thing with US Treasuries. So in 1975, it wasn't just the Saudis, all the other OPEC nations came in. They said, hey, that's a great deal for you, we want to do this too. Well, so all the other oil-producing nations of OPEC agreed to price their oil in dollars and hold their surplus oil proceeds in U.S. government debt securities and in exchange for offers of protection from the U.S. So we got all of OPEC enrolled into the petrodollar system here. So here it is, Wall Street and the U.S. government virtually control all of the oil sales in the world that had to do with OPEC. And that was probably 75–80% of the oil at the time. The petrodollar system begot an unholy alliance between the OPEC nations, Wall Street banks, and the U.S. government. So the results of OPEC agreeing to take only Federal Reserve dollars for oil, it created a demand on the world market for Federal Reserve currency. Now what would happen if they didn't have that, if that demand wasn't there anymore? Well, all those dollars would just come home and we wouldn't be able to just buy a TV from China for $200 anymore. That's all part of this. Nations wanting OPEC oil had to keep Federal Reserve currency in reserve. That's why they call it the reserve currency. They had to keep credits in the Federal Reserve system in order to buy the oil from the Saudis and the OPEC nations. The U.S. could import goods simply by printing and borrowing currency into existence. That's a key. And the same thing they do here, now we've taken this system and we've infected the entire world to where all you have to do, let's just say that we and the Federal Reserve and the government are one entity. What we've done, we've created a machine with this deal to where all we have to do is print money out of the air and we can buy anything in the world we want. That's how this system works. Because the world had to take it because they needed oil too. So we had them over a barrel, so to speak, a barrel of oil. Maybe that's where it came from, I don't know. It allowed the U.S. to pay for the high annual trade deficits. This is key. I put a meme on Facebook today so you could kind of see where we're going with this, or part of where we're going. It allowed the U.S. to pay for high annual trade deficits, money to pay trade deficits printed out of the air by Wall Street, loaned into the economy, the nations of the world forced to take dollars if they needed to buy OPEC oil. So we just created a wealth machine. All this time we've been thinking, oh, it's freedom and capitalism that have been building our standard of living here in the United States and all this neat stuff we have and great stadiums down like SunTrust Bank Stadium. Wow, what, isn't that great? No, it's borrowed. It's borrowed from the future. We don't have the equity to pay for that stuff yet because we haven't earned it. We borrowed it from the future and there comes a time where we have to pay it back. So here's the trade imbalance. This is the date, the last year we had a positive trade balance was the same year the petrodollar system began. And is that proof of what I'm saying or what? This is the mechanism that keeps paying for our trade imbalance. It keeps paying for the trade deficit of as much as $800 billion a year. And it averages about $500 billion a year. This is money leaving our country. It's going out. It's sitting on as foreign reserves for China and all of the people who import things for us. We're buying stuff and it's sitting there in their accounts in the Federal Reserve System. That's how that's working. So just imagine if all of a sudden they stopped taking Federal Reserve currency, then we'd be up here again. Well, what are we going to do? That's why that man wants to bring all of our industries home. That's why he wants to establish these industries here. He's fine for China and all of these countries that we've been buying all these cheap goods from to set up shop here and set up industries here and employ us to build their products here. But if they're going to employ slave labor, he's not for that at all, because that's just perpetuating this, and this is a recipe for failure. So he's on it. He's on this. He understands what's going on with this. All right, going through history. Remember the late 1970s? Remember the inflation? Most everybody was around the 1970s.
When? We remember that? When? With inflation now?
Yeah, with inflation now. All right, we're going to explain to you why that happened. In 1975 through 1980, remember, all of these OPEC oil nations had agreed to use their money to either invest in Wall Street or buy U.S. Treasuries. So when they bought U.S. Treasuries, when that demand for U.S. Treasuries does what? It bids the cost of U.S. Treasuries up, which does what? It lowers the yield. So the yield that these guys were contemplating when they cut the deal, no telling. They looked at the prevailing yield on U.S. Treasuries back in 1975, and they said, hey, this is a great deal, we'll do this, until they started running the yield down by their purchases. So low yields on U.S. Treasuries bought with petrodollars and depreciating dollar due to money printing makes OPEC nations raise prices to make up the difference in lost value. So they had to raise their prices. So this is just an essence spiraling inflation that was going on here. They had to raise prices. So what do? Secretary Blumenthal raises U.S. Treasury interest rates to stabilize the dollar in exchange for a freeze in OPEC oil. So we tell OPEC, okay, tell you what, you guys stop raising prices and we'll raise up the U.S. Treasuries and just peg it rather than just being a market rate. And so they know that they're going to get a constant yield back on their Treasuries that they agreed to buy in the deal. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution, now Iran was one of these OPEC nations. It still is, but it just doesn't cooperate with the petrodollar system, which is why we're always at odds with Iran. The Iranian Revolution threw out the Shah and BP, whom we had put in there 25 years before in 1953, and cut off oil production while nationalizing their oil fields. So the price of oil rises sharply. Well, when price of oil rises sharply, and there's only a certain amount of money in the world, one way to overcome that is just to start printing more money. So the U.S. starts printing more money, borrowing more money, spending more money into the economy to pay for the oil, causing a spiraling inflation. That's what was going on in the late. It had nothing to do with Jimmy Carter. Carter got pegged with all this, but it had nothing to do with him. Fed Chairman Volcker raises interest rates up to 15%. This is to combat the 13% dollar inflation and make reinvestment of petrodollars into U.S. Treasury more active. He had to give them 15% because their money was losing 13% in the meantime. So my first house we bought was like a 12% loan, but other people who had bought in prior to that had like 21% loans and stuff on houses. 18%? Yeah, well this is why. All goes back to everything that we started off with, and really before that. So in 1980, supported by U.S. money and weapons and Kuwaiti loans, Saddam invades Iran. Now, Saddam was put in power by the U.S., by the CIA. Saddam was a puppet for the U.S. government. He was always going to do what we said. So when Iran threw out the Shah, then the CIA had only one way to get back at him, and that was, okay, want to play? They put Saddam into warring with him. He had no reason to go to war with Iran, but he did. So they fought an 8-year war. Iran oil production over time recovers, and Saddam goes into debt to Kuwait. Kuwait was one of the nations, another friendly OPEC nation in the petrodollar system, who we assigned to loan Saddam the money to fight this war with Iran. Well, you know what happens next. In 1990, Saddam petitions OPEC to raise oil prices to pay off his debts, his war debts with Iran that we put him up to in the first place. OPEC said no. So in 1990, Saddam solves his debt problem with Kuwait by annexing it. That was the reason he invaded Kuwait had nothing to do with anything else. It was that he owed them money, and the United States was not going to allow him to get out of it, so he just annexed it. We had Operation Desert Storm, repelling Saddam. See, all this goes back to the petrodollar. Anything that has to do with oil in the Middle East goes back to this insidious satanic system that they put in place. Fast forward, October 1999, the euro dollar is introduced, and it does compete with the Federal Reserve dollar. Well, Saddam announces he's over the Federal Reserve petrodollar. He announces he's only going to take euros in exchange for his oil. That was the kiss of death. I should be solving a lot of mysteries in your head right now, be able to see what the true is, because they never tell us the truth. It's never about what they say. Never. Never. That was a kiss of death for Saddam. Next thing you know, 2001, it all just fits into the narrative here. 2001, 2002, allegations of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction become mainstream news. We know he didn't have the weapons of mass destruction, so it all fits. That the reason why all this happened was because of the petrodollar system. In 2003, a coalition of the willing invaded Iraq. Now, who were the predominant players as the coalition of the willing? The U.S. and Great Britain. U.S. and Great Britain. And who were the Western oil companies involved? We got Chevron, Exxon, and BP. Absolutely. In 2004, oh golly, it shocked me. 2004, Bush administration elects J.P. Morgan Chase to install a new banking system in Iraq. And of course, it's based upon the Federal Reserve petrodollar. So once again, Iraq is exchanging oil for Federal Reserve petrodollars printed out of the air. That's what all this is about. The Iraqi Constitution. Now, this is stuff that nobody knows. Of course, I probably told you a bunch of stuff that nobody knows, but this is a bunch of stuff that nobody knows because fortunately for you, I'm very interested in this and I get down to the truth of these things. All right, it's actually fortunate for anyone to hear the truth. Iraqi Constitution, approved by the U.S. Provisional Government under Bremer, remember his, requires an independent central bank. Here we're going back to the banking thing again. It's the same thing. See, once you pick up on the pattern, if I didn't know to go looking for that, I would have never found it. But I knew it was going to be there. So I go looking for it. There it is. Okay. The Iraqi Constitution requires an independent central bank, meaning that the money is going to be privately owned in Iraq. Well, if it's privately owned, it's part of the central bank cartel of the world, part and parcel of the Federal Reserve. 2007, the Iraq oil law, something again you've never heard of. The Iraq oil law. You can go home and you can Google it. See, countries that have oil reserves like that, where the entire economy is based upon oil, they all have an oil law, and it is the thing that tells them. So that's why they call it that. The Iraq oil law, however, was written by the Bush administration and foisted upon the government of Iraq, which would have privatized the oil reserves, and they submitted this document to the Iraqi parliament. Well, the Iraqi parliament has never passed it. They don't want to privatize their oil fields. It's their oil for their people. They don't want to just give it away to BP and Chevron and Exxon, as they had been doing for the 25 years leading up to the Iranian Revolution. I mean, I'm just telling you the truth here. This is what's going on. So it's still not passed 7 years later, in 2014, which we're going to get to. 2011, the Iraqi Supreme Court declared, even though it was written into the Constitution, they declared that the central bank cannot be independent. Well, first of all, let me go back to that. That one right there, that's what I call strike one. Then when they declared that the central bank cannot be independent, the bank must be under control of the Iraqi government. This is a country trying to assert its sovereign powers. It's a sovereign authority to govern within its borders. That's all Iraq is trying to do here. Well, that was strike two. In 2011, the Iraq government required the U.S. military presence to leave. Remember that, everybody's mad at Obama for not establishing a status of forces agreement with Iraq. Well, he could have, that's probably the one thing in the world that wasn't his fault. They didn't want a status of forces agreement. They didn't want us there. They weren't going to sign anything. They weren't going to sign any of that stuff. So that was strike three. 2014, ISIS mercenaries invade from the west. What's west of Iraq? Jordan. Jordan is a little puppet kingship of the United States, very friendly to us, and that's where all of these entities had been setting up and training. That's all these Toyota pickup trucks with the US 50 cals on the back of them. They were all unleashed. That's a new term. I changed this after we heard what Donald Trump said recently, to invade Iraq and Syria. Now Maliki, when this happens, he's saying, look, he has no reason to lie, because his country's being invaded again. He's just he's reaching out with the truth to anybody who'll hear it. He says, Saudis and the Qataris are openly funding the violence in Anbar. Anbar is out in the western province of Iraq. That's where they came in from. He says, I accuse them of inciting and encouraging the terrorist movements. I accuse them of supporting them politically and in the media, of supporting them with money and or buying weapons from them. I accuse them of leading a war against the Iraqi government. I accuse them of openly hosting leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Takfirists, where they're extremists. Accuse the Saudi government of allowing commissions. That means that they're mercenaries, to attract jihadists and lure them to get them to fight in Iraq. He also blamed both countries for launching Syria's 3-year civil war through Al-Qaeda-linked groups that now operate on both sides of the Iraqi-Syrian border next to Anbar. They are attacking us through Iraq, through Syria indirectly. They are absolutely started the war in Iraq. They started the war in Syria. Maliki said ISIL has been one of the biggest fighting forces in Syria's civil war. Saudi Arabia supports terrorism around the world. Syria, you might think, oh, this is another guy. We don't have any reason to believe what he has to say here. Well, I knew that he was telling the truth because I do this kind of research. In fact, by the time he came out with all this, I had taken all of this to Doug Collins. I took it all to Rob Woodall. I put it into a nice document that they still have that outlines all of the evidence that says that we're supporting our enemies in foreign countries to take down foreign countries' governments. They have all this. Now, but it's not just him. This is going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A month after I gave this presentation for the first time, which was also 2 days before Doug Collins and the rest of the House voted to fund the Syrian rebels. This is all happening at the same time. This happened the next month, vindicating everything that I had told everyone in that presentation and everything that I had given to Doug and to Rob Woodall. Listen to what Chairman Dempsey says.
So our national defense, in terms of stopping ISIL from killing thousands or millions of Americans if they get the capability, really comes down to whether or not we can convince the Arab world to go in there and defeat these guys?
It really comes down to building a coalition so that what the Arab Muslim world sees is them rejecting ISIS, not
They
us
already
defeating them.
reject ISIL. Do you know any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL?
I know major Arab allies who fund them.
Yeah, but do they embrace that? They fund them because the Free Syrian Army couldn't fight Assad. They were trying to beat Assad. Do you know any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL?
I know major Arab allies.
Okay. Our major Arab allies are the Saudis and the Qataris, just like Maliki said. That's who. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, this is not Hank again, this is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying this. Next we have Putin. In that same October 2014, he was speaking to the Western press, and I want you to notice here, it says the world order, new rules or no rules. That's a double entendre. Anybody ever heard of the New World Order? Well, Putin is telling us, he's trying to tell us that this New World Order is real. But, and that's why they chose this terminology up here. He's saying the New Order is it new rules or no rules. So listen to what he tells you about who is orchestrating ISIS in Syria.
President Obama
одну из угроз это
mentioned the Islamic State as one other threat.
помогал вооружать
But tell me, who actually
боролись с
initially helped arm the people who were fighting the Assad governments in Syria? Who was the one providing them with a favorable media climate, with a favorable media environment?
Разве вы не понимаете,
Who
воюет?
facilitated arms sales to those people? Don't you know who is actually fighting in Syria? It's mercenaries. Do you know that mercenaries are people who fight for money? They managed to gain control of some oil deposits in Iraq or in Syria. They started pumping oil there.
Экспортируют, продают
Do they have buyers who buy oil from them?
на все.
Yes, they do. Why aren't sanctions imposed against those buyers? Doesn't the United States know who those people are?
Союзник
Isn't it their own allies who actually buy oil from terrorists?
возможности повлиять.
Don't they have the capacity to influence their allies? Or is it that they don't want to influence them?
They don't want to. I was on WDUN along about the same time in September of 2014, and we were talking about ISIS, and Joe asked me, what would you do about it? I said, stop funding them. Just stop funding them. If you stop funding these guys, then they'll just dry up like a grape in the desert. Well, nobody really understands that we're the ones funding them. That's what's happening here. So, or we know who is, because when you're talking about they're pumping oil out of the desert and they're selling it on the world market and all that, well, there is a buyer. Just like Putin said, there's a buyer for that. Well, the buyer is paying for it out of Federal Reserve currency, which in every Federal Reserve transaction worldwide, they were very clever with this, actually gets routed through the United States before it's consummated. So we could stop them tomorrow. All you have to do is shut down the accounts that the money's going to. And that's what he's telling you there. All right, this is General Flynn. You've been seeing General Flynn kind of hanging around with this guy over here? Well, General Flynn was the director of Defense Intelligence Agency. He's the guy that's in charge of understanding what's going on over there and feeding it to the decision makers. And listen to what, anybody ever seen this video?
No.
I'm going to tell you, this is why he knows so much about Hillary and the connection between Hillary and ISIS. Listen to what he says here to Al Jazeera, because Obama fired him because he was speaking out against all this.
In 2012, your agency was saying, quote, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. In 2012, the US was helping coordinate arms transfers to those same groups. Why did you not stop that if you're worried about the rise of quote-unquote Islamic?
I hate to say it's not my job, but that my job was to ensure that the accuracy of our intelligence that was being presented was as good as it could be.
You are basically saying that even in government at the time, you knew those groups were around, you saw this analysis,
Sure.
and you were arguing against it, but who wasn't listening?
I think the administration.
So the administration turned a blind eye to your analysis.
I don't know if they turned a blind eye. I think it was a decision. I think it was a willful decision.
A willful decision to go support an insurgency that had Salafists, Al-Qaeda, and
A
Muslim
willful
Brotherhood.
decision to do what they're doing, which you'd have to really ask the president, what is it that he actually is doing?
So when Doug Collins, you might remember the letter that we sent to Doug Collins voted to fund the Syrian rebels being trained in Saudi Arabia. We sent him a letter. We don't understand why you're voting for this, because you're voting to fund terrorists who are taking down a foreign government that has done nothing to the United States of America. He tried to answer it one time, he got himself in deep water, and he stopped answering the questions after I sent him another one. Now, so there's a connection between Flynn and Donald Trump. Donald Trump, Flynn is his major military advisor. There's nobody who knows more about what's going on in the world than the former director of military intelligence. That's why Flynn is there. Plus, he's a patriot. So he's telling Donald Trump what's going on in there. And then there is a narrative out there that says that, oh, all of this happened in a vacuum, that it was something that they couldn't foresee when they were trying to train certain good rebels to fight against Assad, even though Assad had done nothing for us. They couldn't foresee that the good rebels were going to go to the highest bidder, as Putin said.
The mercenaries.
They're all mercenaries, and they also couldn't see that the mercenaries in the first place, ISIS, was also being paid for by our major Arab allies. So this is that unholy alliance over there based upon the petrodollar. You know, what is it? What a weary web we weave when we first begin to deceive. That's what this is. Once you start deceiving, you can't stop. That's why Hillary can't stop lying. I mean, she's in this like you wouldn't believe. All right, so what was it, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago? Donald Trump came out and said this.
She apologized for unleashing ISIS across the world. She and Barack Obama unleashed ISIS. Whether you like it or don't like it, whether you want to hear it or don't, that's what happened.
That is what happened. He's exactly right. Man, the guy has got nerves of steel. His son, I saw him on TV recently, said, "My dad is fearless." Yeah, he is fearless. These people are shaking in their boots because of Donald Trump right now. They are deathly afraid of him because he knows what they've been up to. Remember these guys? We talked about this. This is all part of the Unholy Alliance, 15 of the 19th hijackers. We couldn't go after the Saudis, as it's turned out, even in the 28 pages which have recently been released to the public, and it indicts the Saudis for supporting the 9/11 hijackers. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of what's happening, of what was happening 2 years ago in Iraq.
Hank,
So
why would they do that?
why would who do
Why
what?
would the Saudi government, were they back at this?
They could. A lot of this is just conjecture of why they do things, but you see, what we have here is a dollar that is being enforced militarily on the world. They don't want it, but every time a Saddam, or as it turns out, a Gaddafi, decide that they're no longer going to play in the system, then all of a sudden they get deposed. Assad doesn't want to play in the system. That's why they keep going after Assad. So they could foresee that a debt-based world monetary system was going to have its day, I believe. And so they started planning for that. And that's why, the reason why the world is such a crazy place right now, I believe, is because they're running out of time. Guy right there. He's really running out of time. Now, if any of those other 16, maybe 15, but I expect 16, the Republicans had been the nominee, I think they'd all been sitting back. They wouldn't be concerned about it because they'd have both sides here.
Is BRICS causing them a lot of consternation as well as Trump?
I'll get to BRICS at the very end so you can see where all that's coming up. But yeah, BRICS just doesn't have the horsepower to work against them. One man, has the horsepower to go up against these guys, but the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, themselves, they really don't have that much horsepower. But you put one man in the Oval Office there who knows the truth and is righteous and wants to do the right thing by the American people and the world, that's why they're afraid of him. That's why they wanted any of the other 16, but not him. Anybody. Just don't put him in there. Yes, ma'am.
I think there was another candidate that also knows what's up, that you're admitting from your... Rand Paul knows what's going on. His
He might.
mother has been bitching about the Federal Reserve for longer than I've been living.
Yeah.
So,
And Rand did come out and say that, that he wasn't going to vote for us to be Al-Qaeda's Air Force.
right.
He did do that, and you're exactly right. I shouldn't have lumped Rand in there.
Thank you. He is an exception to the
he-
rest of them.
Yes, he is the exception. However, Rand, if I know this, and now you guys all know this, Rand knows this too. You know, where's
He did
Rand
it
been?
before.
You
He
know,
asked
the only,
Hillary why she was giving arms to the people in Libya.
I understand. It's just like Doug knows it, and Rob knows it, and all these guys know it, but nobody's really saying anything. The only person who's coming out here and saying that Barack and Hillary unleashed ISIS on the world is that guy right there. Because he's the only guy, he's the only guy who's really coming out and telling you the ultimate bottom line truth. That's the point of that. But you're exactly right, point well taken. All right, in northern Iraq, up in Kurdistan, you've heard about the Kurds. And the Kurds are kind of friendly to us, and well, they're actually kind of friendly to the power brokers who are running all of this because they cooperate. There's a pipeline that they built in northern Iraq for the Kurds to steal the Iraq oil, the Iraqi people's oil that happened to be located in northern Iraq. So the